Today we're going to learn what Aboriginal peoples can teach us about dwarves. I mean, fantasy dwarves from here, Erebor. I want to talk about Guugu Yimithirr. I haven't said that right. We're also going to be discussing Einstein and why dwarves will never understand the theory of relativity. You see, I'm going to argue that in a lot of fantasy genres, dwarves have this ability to always know what direction they're facing. That's north, that's west, even when underground. I'm going to argue that this is because of language and not a racial ability. And as such, a dwarf who spends much of their time speaking common, such as the dwarves in Tolkien's Middle-earth, aren't going to be able to keep that ability. They would lose it over time as they begin to think in common. But for as long as they can think in dwarvish and continue to practice that language, then they will be able to keep that racial ability. And this is possibly why, in Tolkien's world, dwarvish is a secret language. It all comes down to frames of reference. You see, in English, we have 3 frames of reference. Absolute frame of reference: the Stegosaurus is to the north of the dragon, and we shall call it this land to the north. I think we should call it your grave. Intrinsic frame of reference: the Stegosaurus is in front of the dragon. Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal. Mine is an evil laugh. And of course, relative frame of reference. To you, the Stegosaurus is on the left of the dragon. English gives us the ability to say all 3 of these frames of reference, but we typically use a relative or intrinsic frame, with exception of when we're dealing with topography, meaning Britain is to the northwest of Europe, and no longer in it, apparently. Oops. However, in Guugu Yimithirr... I'm sorry, I do not wish to insult any of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. In fact, I'm not even sure, because I'm not even from that hemisphere, I don't even know if that's an offensive term to say Aboriginal or not. I really mean no offence. But in Guugu Yimithirr, there is no concept of an intrinsic or relative frame of reference, only absolute. The Stegosaurus is to the north of the dragon. And in order to be able to communicate this actually has an interesting effect on the brain itself. Yes, the language you think in has an effect on your noggin. I can only think about glitter. For the people who speak Guugu Yimithirr, they have the ability to always know what direction they're facing. They keep a mental map in their mind. Even if they're in unfamiliar circumstances, they'll just know what direction they're facing. And I argue that this is where the dwarfish ability comes from, to the extent that even when speaking in common, they're unlikely to use concepts like on the left, on the right. It just wouldn't be their intrinsic way of thinking. They would say on the east, on the west. The more a dwarf uses the common tongue and uses frames of reference that are either relative or intrinsic and start saying on the left and on the right, the moment that starts seeping into their speech, that's the point where they're starting to think in relative terms. And at that point, they're going to begin to lose the ability to think in absolute directions, to think in cardinal points. So let's say you've been knocked out, you dropped to 0 hit points and you're in a new location and you have no idea which way you're facing because you're in an interior environment and have no frame of reference for knowing which direction you're facing. Well, short of asking which way is north, you would use terms like on the far side of the river, upstream, downstream. But there's going to be an issue there, a disorientation whilst that vital part of your brain that is involved both in linguistics and in your sense of self-awareness is confused. So for a dwarf to drop to 0 hit points, it's going to leave them really disorientated, even if just for a moment, whilst they try to get their bearings again, especially if they're in an unfamiliar environment or if they've moved since regaining consciousness. Not only that, but when you think in absolutes and you aren't using relatives, that's going to pose some problems scientifically when dealing with Einstein's theory of relativity, for example. You could even argue that perhaps dwarves shouldn't be as inventive as they're often portrayed. Maybe that's going a little bit too far, but certainly some concepts are going to be harder to understand when you think in absolutes. Certainly concepts that are common in cyberpunk, which gets me to thinking that if you're doing a cyberpunk game with dwarves, maybe, just maybe, dwarves should be sneered at and looked down by those who get these concepts and just think, you're an idiot. Nature gives with one hand and it takes with the other. So there you have it. Dwarves have a part of their brain dedicated to knowing what direction they're facing, but that comes from their language, and anyone could learn that ability. Probably not an English person, we only speak English here, but anyone else can learn that. Probably not an American, they only speak Americanized English, but anyone else could learn that ability.